The arrows proved to be more than enough, as shown in the Emperor's inability to run away from our men. He injured his ankle and collapsed onto the floor, where after a few minutes, he bled out. So said the report given to him by one of his co-conspirators. Loukas Notaras was overcome with relief. He knew that if the assassination failed, he and his fellow noblemen would be jailed and tried for treason. While yes, most of the nobility praised and admired Constantine for his handling of the empire, his adoption of Turkish battle tactics along with their armor had also sown seeds of dissent amongst his soldiers, some of whom pledged their support to Loukas Notaras following the news of Constantine's death. Many soldiers serving in the thematic armies of Thessaloniki and Constantinople considered Veterinus too influenced by the Turks, leading to them rejecting Constantine's succession plan and opting for Loukas Notaras to become Ilinos' regent and teach him the ways of being a proper Roman. To those who loved Constantine, Notaras told them that he was marching to Constantinople to avenge his murder and uncover the true culprit. The gates of Constantinople were open to his army. Not even an hour after his arrival, he sent out a list to the empire's governors that had names of people deemed enemies of the state, and that it was the job of every man in the empire to kill said people. In the list were Anicius, Veterinus, Laurentius Becos, and Thomas Palaiologos. Before anyone in the capital could protest, Notaras let his army loose in the streets, commencing a 6-day purge in Constantinople that saw all of Constantine Palaiologos' allies killed or imprisoned. The army also had another assignment given to them by their new emperor: to find Ilinos and bring him home. In order to rule in the long run, he needed a strong claim of legitimacy, and Ilinos was just that. If any harm was done to the son of Constantine, it only looked bad on him, since he was now responsible for the boy, given his denunciation of Veterinus and the annulment of Veterinus' legal guardianship of the boy. Citizens that tried to pass off random kids as Ilinos for a reward were hastily given a hefty fine, and in some cases jailed. Notaras grew more anxious as the days went by. His supporters were told prior to the assassination that no harm would come to the child, so when Ilinos suddenly disappeared and failed to be found after a bloody assassination of the imperial family, it looked like Notaras had indeed murdered a child. In order to keep the nobility pleased, Notaras gave them a donative, and promised them that should they keep their support for him, he'd give them high positions in his new government. Some took the donative while others remained unimpressed and traveled to either Morea or Nicaea, territory held by Thomas Palaiologos and Veterinus respectively. It was becoming apparent that no matter what he did going forward, there was going to be a civil war. He quickly sent out his most loyal supporters to Thessaloniki, Adrianople, and Athens. He wanted to seize control of those cities as they held the most value due to the amount of money they made, and because if anyone tried to rise up, they'd have to take those cities before moving to Constantinople. Adrianople and Athens were quickly incorporated into Notaras' sphere of influence, but Thessaloniki shut its gates. The people inside the city considered Laurentius Becos a hero of the Roman war against Skanderbeg. When they heard that he was deemed an enemy of the state, they turned against Notaras for trying to kill a man who was in their minds a just man. The local population rose up and had the city's garrison massacred. They sent out a letter to Thomas and Veterinus asking for their support in the revolt against Loukas Notaras. Shortly after receiving the people's letter, Thomas began to muster his army in Morea, and sent 2,000 of his already levied men to Thessaloniki. Thomas's court urged him to take as much of Greece as he could before Veterinus arrived. The court feared that if they both marched and took Constantinople together, Thomas would still have to acquiesce to Constantine's will, and have Veterinus take the throne, which saw the possibility of Veterinus choosing Gregorius and his descendants as the next in line, effectively tossing the Palaiologos family aside from what should have been their empire. Since time was of the essence, Thomas sent a request to the Venetian cities in Morea and Crete, asking if there were any mercenaries willing to serve him in the coming fight. The Venetians were skeptical at first, since they had fought Thomas just a few years prior. But Thomas reassured them that under his leadership, Rome would abandon any ties it previously held with the Turks, and focus on mending its relations with the Catholic Church. This incentivized them to join his cause, bolstering Thomas's numbers by 3,000 men. When both armies united, they encamped outside of Athens and planned their next move. But upon seeing Thomas's army and having heard nothing from Notaras back at the capital, the garrison inside of Athens surrendered, handing control of the city over to Thomas. The city's Catholic tried to escape by boat, but he was stopped by Venetian soldiers who restricted access to the city's port. Undeterred, he tried to leave the city by road, disguising himself as a tradesman. Unluckily for him, he was identified by one of the city's inhabitants and was promptly arrested by Thomas's soldiers. Under interrogation, the man leaked the plot of Constantine's assassination, giving Thomas the names of people involved. He also confessed that Notaras never got his hands on Elinos, and that the boy was nowhere in Constantinople or mainland Greece. Thomas pressed for more information, but the man exclaimed that he had confessed everything he knew. Thomas felt his heart drop and began to wonder where Elinos was. If Notaras got a hold of Elinos, his legitimacy was secured and there would be no further reason for the revolt to continue. If Vetranus got a hold of Elinos, Constantine's original succession plan would go into effect, and have Vetranus become the regent, forcing Thomas back into Morea and into obscurity. The only way Thomas could make a name for himself and keep his family in power was to find and secure Elinos. He sent a dozen men to Nicaea, hoping they'd find a child and in the process kill Vetranus. Onesius was only to be spared because of his usefulness to Constantine during his reign. When asked what to do with Gregorius, the son of Vetranus, Thomas shrugged and said to only kill him if he got in the way, sensing no real threat in him. After the capture of Athens, Thomas resumed his march to Constantinople, having towns surrender to him without a fight. The spirits of his men were high, but Thomas reminded them to be alert. This reminder went unheard, as when an army loyal to Loukas Notaras ambushed them, they scrambled and began to panic. Thomas ordered his Venetian contingent to step into the fray, which they did with ruthless efficiency, cutting down the enemy forces thanks to their superior swords and armor. Not wanting to be outshined, the Marine soldiers got their act together and jumped into the fray, finally dispersing the enemy army. The rout of the enemy army allowed Thomas to take Thessaloniki unopposed, and he finally reunited with Laurentius Begos, an old friend of his late brother, and esteemed veteran among the army. With him at his side and at the command of an army, deserters began to pour in from the Constantinians' Dematic army, severely limiting the amount of soldiers Loukas Notaras had at his disposal. Unwilling to leave Constantinople in the fear of Vetranus' surprise landing and taking the city in his absence, Notaras made the decision to have all remaining soldiers man the Theodosian walls, effectively abandoning all of his allies outside of Constantinople. While some saw this as an act of cowardice, Notaras saw it as practical. Thomas had nowhere near the amount of men Mehmet II had during his siege of Constantinople. No matter what he did, there was no way he was going to take the capital without suffering a staggering amount of losses. Constantinople was in this case well fortified, well stocked, and the spirits of his men were high. The men on the walls began to celebrate, mocking Thomas for even daring to take on a city that had successfully repulsed the Ottomans. Outside the Theodosian walls, the Moraine army began to encamp and got ready for what was looking to be a tedious siege. Wanting to avoid senseless casualties, Thomas and Laurentius sent in spies into the city and had them assess what was going on inside, giving them instructions to spread the word that Elinos was dead and Notaras had the bodies of the imperial family burned in a pyre. At first, the populace was inclined to brush the rumors aside, thinking, Notaras wouldn't kill the imperial family, he'd never put the empire in danger. But as time went on and Notaras kept adding more names of people deemed as enemies of the state, many of whom were allied to Constantine at one point or another, these rumors began to look more like fact than anything else. The shift in attitude didn't go unnoticed by the usurper, for while he was out and surveying the defense of the Theodosian walls, Notaras couldn't help but notice the amount of people glaring at him as he passed by, their hands clenching their weapons and a look of disdain marked in their faces. Knowing the assassination plot had been leaked to the people, and worse, the soldiers, Notaras rushed back to the capital and frantically gathered as much money as he could, pouring all of it into a small chest. He had one of his guards carry the chest, and they both rushed back to the walls, where they'd be met with a group of soldiers packing their gear up and heading for the gates of the city, holding white pieces of cloth. Notaras got in front of the soldiers' faces and asked them to reconsider their decision, motioning his hands to the chest filled with money. The soldiers looked at him and then at each other. They tossed their weapons aside and made way for the chest. Notaras warmly smiled and exhaled a sigh of relief. Before going back home, Notaras would tell his soldiers that they were free to join the Moraine army if they wished, but in doing so they'd be joining the enemies of the state, and their families would be deemed as such. He could see that comment had made his soldiers visibly uncomfortable. He continued and said that they had another option, to swear unyielding loyalty to him and his family, and in return, they'd be paid generously and their families would be taken care of for generations. To this he was met with cheers and applause, the soldiers raising their weapons and shields and chanting Notaras' name. He had his spies inside the city weed out Thomas's and Laurentius' spies, having them publicly executed for misleading the righteous people of Constantinople. Though Notaras was able to buy the loyalty of the army, the same could not be applied for the people of Constantinople. The public execution of spies had pushed the people in Constantinople to protest against Notaras and the unjust killings of fellow Romans. In response, Notaras would disperse the protesters and set a mandatory curfew for people in the city. At night, while people slept, he'd let his soldiers wander the city, which would inevitably see some vandalism occur. The people would complain to the Patriarch, imploring him to knock some sense into Loukas Notaras, to stop the killings, but even the Patriarch wouldn't do much as he feared being labeled as an enemy. As the weeks dragged on, the fighting between both armies ground to a halt, as word had arrived from Morea that an army led by Vetranus and Gregorius landed and took Mistras. Vetranus' army seemed to have consisted of 12,000 Turkish soldiers as well as 1,000 Genoese mercenaries. If they were to take Morea and everything south of Greece, Vetranus would be able to raise even more soldiers, leaving Thomas and Loukas Notaras at a number disadvantage. Not only that, Vetranus likely had Elenos under his care, which made both Notaras and Thomas's claims to the throne obsolete. Vetranus sent a letter to Laurentius Becos offering him the entire theme of Thessaloniki, an offer that Laurentius took without another thought, taking with him some of the most experienced veterans of the Roman army. Thomas, flabbergasted, was forced to negotiate a ceasefire with Loukas Notaras, and both men would meet inside Constantinople. If there was anything that both men could agree on, it was that Rome was for Romans and that Vetranus was only able to launch his bid for power because of none other than the Turks. Notaras told everyone in Constantinople that Vetranus wanted to turn the Roman Empire into an Ottoman puppet, and that it should be every man's duty to kill the rebel. Thomas openly supported Loukas Notaras and began making preparations for the battle against Vetranus, planning to meet him a few miles away from Athens. Once set on his battle plans, Thomas began to move his army, and shook Notaras' hand in reconciliation. Both men reached an agreement that would see Thomas become the new heir and Megas Domestikos, as well as the sole ruler of Morea. Notaras wished him luck and gifted him a barrel filled with the finest wine money could buy. Thomas nodded and left Constantinople. Notaras watched as the Moraine army vanished from the horizon, his smile along with it. He knew that once Vetranus was taken care of, Thomas would immediately break his word and march on Constantinople at the head of a much larger army. It was only a matter of time, he thought to himself. He began to feel exhausted and called for his bodyguards to take him home. No, wait. Take me to the theater. Where it happened. His bodyguards obliged and took Loukas Notaras to the place where Constantine XI died. Thanks to the mandated curfew, there was no one to bother him as he strolled through the vacant seats of the theater. He always felt a sense of disgust when dealing with the common people of the city, so being there by himself made him feel relaxed. He surveyed the area and stood right on the spot where Constantine was said to have collapsed. He spit on the ground and said, "You poisoned your mind with those foolish ideas. Your vision was nothing but a farce. I'm glad you're dead." Having let his guard down, Notaras failed to realize the woman watching him from a distance. Before he could get a look at her face, she'd already run off and was nowhere to be found. He felt a sense of dread come over him, but brushed said feeling aside. So long as his army remained loyal, there was simply no threat to him. Thomas laid awake unable to sleep. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know why or how he got to where he was. He wanted sole ownership of Morea, so he got it. He wanted to lead an army into battle, so he did. He wanted to become emperor now that his brother was dead, so he was. But why? Why did he have ambitions? Why did he feel that way? Why had the last 2 years of his life felt so empty? He didn't know. News of Thomas's murder traveled quickly. In Constantinople, the people immediately accused Loukas Notaras of having ordered the killing, putting together the strings of murder that had occurred after Constantine's death. They demanded the Patriarch to do something, promote another emperor, anything, so long as it put an end to the killings. When the Patriarch did nothing yet again, the people had enough and began rioting. Using the city's garrison to quell the rioters, Loukas Notaras began doubling down on his treatment of so-called enemies, hanging any and all rioters that were captured, to the disgust of the city's garrison. Notaras' terror only came to a halt when news arrived that Vitrinus had managed to incorporate 6,000 men of the Moravian army into his own, marching to Constantinople with over 19,000 men. Notaras couldn't spare a single soldier in the defense of the Theodosian walls, and so offered to make concessions with the people, should they put their differences aside, and work together to defend the city. But the people were past negotiation. The woman who had overheard Notaras during his visit to the theater had come forward and exposed Notaras for what he truly was, a traitor and a usurper. Outside the walls, Vitrinus and his soldiers tried pleading with the city's garrison to open up the gates and give up Notaras. Vitrinus assured them there would be no reprisals of any kind, so long as they opened the gates. This still didn't work, so Vitrinus began deliberating his options. He didn't want to throw men away in the assault of the Theodosian walls. It'd be far too costly. But at the same time, if he waited, the people inside Constantinople could rally under another emperor, and Vitrinus would have to contend with yet another claimant. Gregorius rolled his eyes at his father's deliberation, and made the decision to assault the Theodosian walls, promising to kill every Notaras loyalist in the city. The assault of the walls began with a barrage of cannon fire. Vitrinus, having manned the walls during the 1453 siege, knew of its weak points, and had his cannon fire centered to those areas. Inside the city, the riots would escalate, as due to the manpower shortage, the people were able to overrun Notaras' bodyguards and storm the imperial palace. Notaras would try to run, but he was apprehended by the mob and dragged across the streets of Constantinople. He pleaded with the people, offering them all of the money he had, trying to rile them up against Vitrinus, the true enemy of Rome. But the mob simply beat him repeatedly, with each punch and kick slowly draining the life out of him. Even in death, the people refused to let Notaras go unscathed. When Vitrinus received the remains of Loukas Notaras, he was barely able to identify his remains, as his entire body was riddled with wounds. Gregorius was tasked with disposing of Notaras' body, doing so without a word. He began to dig up a shallow hole and thought of how far Notaras must have gone to push the people to open murder. He rested the shovel into the ground and opened up the bag with Notaras' body. The stench overwhelmed him, leading him to closing the bag and kicking the body into the grave. Once the smell had dissipated, Gregorius looked over at the body in pity. There was so much he could have done differently, if it were him at the helm. He picked up his shovel and began covering the grave with dirt, finishing his assigned job. While on his way back to Constantinople, Gregorius stopped himself in his tracks, hearing an echo of a voice behind him. He tried to ignore it, but the voice pleaded with him. He turned back and walked up to the grave he had dug earlier. Gregorius held his hands together and began mumbling something underneath his breath. After about a minute, Gregorius stopped and squatted down to the grave, staring at it solemnly. He brushed his hand onto the ground and whispered to the grave a single phrase. "Rome is for Romans."